Well, hey, what's up? Welcome back to House Church, man. We are so glad that you're here today. Look, we are kicking off a brand new series today, and really, it's so much more than a series, but this is something you're going to hear us say a whole lot in the coming weeks and months. It's just welcome home, right? I mean, we want to welcome you home to a faith family. We want to welcome you home to a heavenly Father. We want to welcome you home to a people, a group where you can belong even before you believe. And look, we want this to be a thing, not just where we're saying it from a stage or from a screen, but part of our everyday conversation, right? The people that we see in our communities, in our neighborhoods, at the grocery store, that we are welcoming them home into a family, no matter their choices, no matter the decisions that have been made. Look, the past year and a half, it's been tough, right? It's been tough on a lot of people. It's just a lot of the things that we had as foundations for us, that, man, those things have been stripped away, right? And I mean, let's just be honest, a lot of what has happened is we've begun to fill some of those gaps with maybe even some pretty destructive habits. And there's a lot of people who are feeling a lot of grief, a lot of remorse, and maybe even have lost a sense of worth and identity and purpose and who they are, and don't know where to turn next. Well, what we want to say is, hey, this is where you turn, right? Come back to your Heavenly Father and come back to a family that loves you regardless of your choices and can help get you back to the place where God's called you to be. Now, look, a lot of where this comes from is Luke chapter 15. It's a parable. It's a story that Jesus teaches, the parable we call the Prodigal Son, the parable of the Prodigal Son, right? And in the story that Jesus teaches there's a father, a rich man who has two sons, and one of the sons comes to his dad one day and asks for his inheritance, says, hey, look, give me the inheritance that's coming my way. I don't want to be here anymore. And so the son takes his inheritance and he moves away to a far land and he squanders the money. That's what Jesus says. He squanders the money. I mean, he doesn't have a job to go to, doesn't have friends or family to hang out, can't go to school anymore, and has a lot of money in his pocket. So he begins just to do all sorts of crazy stuff, right? And he finds himself in a really broken place, not just financially, but a broken place mentally and physically and emotionally and spiritually. And it says that one day that he kind of had a coming to himself moment, a self-awareness moment. He says, well, wait a second. I'm broken here, and I don't even know where I'm going to get my next meal from. But even the people that worked for my dad, man, they were better off than I am. And so he devises this plan. He rehearses this speech. He says, I'm going to go back to my dad, and I'm going to say, hey, listen, I know even the people that work for you are better off, but let me come and pay me to be a hired hand. And he says this in verse 19 of Luke chapter 15. He says, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. My fear is that's where a lot of people are. They've lost their sense of worth in who they are and who God has called them to be. And so the story goes on and says, as he goes back home, his father is waiting for him, and he sees him from a far way off coming down the road, and the father takes off running after him. And before the son can ever get to the speech that he's rehearsed, the father wraps his arms around him and he embraces him and he celebrates and he throws a party because he says, my son that was lost is now found. And that's the type of celebration we want to have, right? That's the type of love that we want to have, this moment of celebrating and welcoming people back home, not in judgment, but in love and in grace and in mercy. And so look, over the next several weeks, we're going to talk about this idea of truth and the types of truths that will call us home and will keep us home, right? Because ultimately, what the son knew to be true about his father is what brought him home. But the things that he got wrong about his father is what kept him away for so long. It's what caused the most pain in his life. He knew what his father had, but man, he didn't know his father's heart for him, and that's what we want to discover, right? We want to be reminded of God's heart for us, God's compassion and his love for us, who he is and who we are in him. And so we're going to talk a lot about this idea of truth, these foundational truths that sustain us when life goes haywire, and these types of truths that will compel us to act just like the father did in running after the people that are lost, that are hurting, that are broken. And so the next several weeks, we're going to talk about this thing called the Apostles' Creed, right? And listen, we're not going to maybe you'll memorize it. I don't know. That's not our goal. Our goal is not to memorize this creed. A creed, by the way, is just like a statement of belief. Our goal is to use this creed as a launching off point to discover these truths and to unearth these truths and cement them in our lives so that we have this foundation to always come back to. And so as we get ready to talk about that, right, we're going to go all the way back to the beginning, talk about creation and God's power and the goodness of God we see in creation and our purpose in that. But before we get to all that, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of truth some more, okay? So Hebrews chapter 11, this is why I think truth and having these foundational truths are so important. Hebrews chapter 11 is what we call the Hall of Faith, right? And the reason it's called that is because the author of Hebrews lists out all these different people that we'd consider heroes of our faith. Abraham and Moses and David and Rahab. I mean, all these people that lived these great lives. But the reality of their stories, we read through them, the reality of stories, they're far from perfect people, right? I mean, they made a lot of bad choices. But what makes them heroes of the faith is that despite their flaws and their failures and their inconsistencies, they always come back to these same truths that root them in who God is and God's goodness and who they are in God. And they're always able to come back to and rediscover the purpose God's placed in them, right? And so I'll give you a couple of examples from Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8 says, "By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance." Love this. "And he went out not knowing where he was going." You know, Abraham's whole story is that God called him one day to pick up his stuff, to get his family and move to a place that he didn't even know where he was going. And Abraham was willing to obey. I mean, he obeyed, he followed God, not because he knew where he was going, but because he knew who he was following. The truth of who God was and the truth of God's goodness gave him the clarity to step into that calling. The writer of Hebrews keeps going with a story. Verse 17, Hebrews chapter 11 says, "By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son." Verse 19 says, "He, being Abraham considered that God was able even to raise his son from the dead." Again, Abraham didn't know what God was going to do, but man, he believed, he knew that God could do and God would do something special and extraordinary. And it was that confidence in who God was that allowed Abraham to move forward and to keep obeying God despite the uncertainties around him. And we need that clarity and we need that confidence, right? Because look, all around us, life around us, there is no clarity. I mean, there is no confidence to be found in the circumstances around us because it's changing every day. But when we can rest our confidence in the truth of who God is and the truth of who we are in God, well, then we can have the confidence and the clarity we need to step into the purpose God's called us to. One of my favorite lines in this whole chapter, Hebrews chapter 11, it's in verse 34. You can go back and read the couple of verses before that. But the writer is talking about all the people that he says might go unnamed. There might not be remembered for who they were, but for what they did. And he says that they quenched the power of fire. They escaped the edge of the sword. They were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, and they put foreign armies to fight. You know, the right truth about God provides strength in our weakness. Because it's when we come to a place like the Son, we're able to go back to our Heavenly Father and say, I know I've made mistakes, but God, I know you're good to welcome me back home. It's in those moments that the things we consider weaknesses become weapons in God's purpose for us. And so look, man, I'm really excited about this conversation today. You can take some time as a group and just talk through maybe the times that you feel like you've wandered away. Talk about the truths that brought you back to who God is and the truths that keep you rooted in the purpose that God has for you. Man, look, we love you. I'm so thankful for you. We'll see you soon.